Marcus Mosiah Garvey Jr., born on the 17th of August 1887 in St. Ann's Bay, a town in the British colony of Jamaica. He was a Jamaican political activist. In the context of colonial Jamaican society, which had a colorist social hierarchy, Garvey was considered at the lowest end, being a so-called black child who was of African descent. However, later genetic research nevertheless revealed that he had ancestors from the Iberian Peninsula. Garvey's paternal great-grandfather had been born in Jamaica. His surname, which was of Irish origin, had been inherited from his people, former colonizers. His father, Malcus Garvey, was a stonemason. His mother, Sarah Richards, was a domestic servant and the daughter of peasant farmers. Malcus had had two previous wives before Sarah, having 6 children between them. Sarah bore him 4 additional children, of whom Marcus was the youngest, although 2 died in infancy. Because of his profession, Malcus's family were wealthier than many of their peasant neighbors. They were petite bourgeois. Malcus was, however, reckless with his money and over the course of his life lost most of the land he owned to meet payments. Malcus had a book collection and was self-educated. He also served as a deacon at a local Wesleyan church. Malcus was an intolerant and punitive father and husband. He never had a close relationship with his son. Up to the age of 14, Garvey attended a local church school. Further education was unaffordable for the family. When not in school, Garvey worked on his maternal uncle's tenant farm. He had friends with whom he once broke the windows of a church, resulting in his arrest. Some of his friends were white, although he found that as they grew older, they distanced themselves from him. He later recalled that a close childhood friend was a white girl. "We were 2 innocent fools who never dreamed of a race feeling and problem." In 1901, Marcus was apprenticed to his godfather, a local printer. In 1904, the printer opened another branch at Port Maria, where Garvey began to work, traveling from St. Ann's Bay each morning. In 1905, he moved to Kingston, where he boarded in Smith Village, a working-class neighborhood. In the city, he secured work with the printing division of the P.A. Benjamin Manufacturing Company. He rose quickly through the company ranks, becoming their first so-called Afro-Jamaican foreman. Keep in mind, paper genocide was used in Jamaica as well. His sister and mother, by this point estranged from his father, moved to join him in the city. In January 1907, Kingston was hit by an earthquake that reduced much of the city to rubble. He, his mother, and his sister were left to sleep in the open for several months. In March 1908, his mother died. While in Kingston, Garvey converted to Catholicism. He was the founder and first President General of the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League, UNIA-ACL, commonly known as UNIA, through which he declared himself Provisional President of Africa. Garvey was ideologically a Black Nationalist and Pan-Africanist. His ideas came to be known as Garveyism. Garvey was born into a moderately prosperous Afro-Jamaican family in St. Ann's Bay, and was apprenticed into the print trade as a teenager. Working in Kingston, he became involved in trade unionism. He later lived briefly in Costa Rica, Panama, and England. On returning to Jamaica, he founded the UNIA in 1914. In 1916, he moved to the United States and established a UNIA branch in New York City's Harlem district. Now, this is where the U.S. government comes in at. Emphasizing unity between Africans and the African diaspora, he campaigned for an end to European colonial rule in Africa and advocated the political unification of the continent. He envisioned a unified Africa as a one-party state governed by himself that would enact laws to ensure black racial purity. Although he never visited the continent, he was committed to the Back to Africa movement, arguing that part of the diaspora should migrate there. Keep in mind, Garvey became a York Rite, Freemason, and a Knights of Templar, which is ran by dark-skinned Moors. Garveyist ideas became increasingly popular, and the UNIA grew in membership. His black separatist views and his relationship with white racists like the Ku Klux Klan, KKK, in the interest of advancing their shared goal of racial separatism, caused a division between Garvey and other prominent African-American civil rights activists such as Webb Du Bois, who promoted racial integration. Webb Du Bois and several other celebrities at that time were being blackmailed by COINTELPRO operation to run a smear campaign against Marcus Garvey. Believing that black people needed to be financially independent from white-dominated societies, Garvey launched various businesses in the U.S., including the Negro Factories Corporation and Negro World newspaper. In 1919, he became president of the Black Star Line shipping and passenger company, designed to forge a link between North America and Africa and facilitate African-American migration to Liberia. Settling in Kingston with his wife, Amy Jacques, Garvey established the People's Political Party in 1929, briefly serving as a city councilor. With the UNIA in increasing financial difficulty, he relocated to London in 1935, where his anti-socialist stance distanced him from many of the city's black activists. In Jamaica, he is recognized as a national hero, the first person to be recognized as such. His ideas exerted a considerable influence on such movements as Rastafari, the Nation of Islam, and the Black Power movement. Garvey became a trade unionist, vice president of the compositors section of the Printers Union, and took a leading role in the November 1908 print workers' strike. The strike was broken several weeks later and Garvey was sacked. Henceforth branded a troublemaker, Garvey was unable to find work in the private sector. He then found temporary employment with a government printer. As a result of these experiences, Garvey became increasingly angry at the inequalities present in Jamaican society. Garvey involved himself with the National Club, Jamaica's first nationalist organization, becoming its first assistant secretary in April 1910. The group campaigned to remove the governor of Jamaica, Sidney Olivier, from office, and to end the migration of Indian coolies or indentured workers to Jamaica, as they were seen as a source of economic competition by the established population. With fellow club member Wilfred Domingo, he published a pamphlet expressing the group's ideas, The Struggling Mass. In early 1910, Garvey began publishing a magazine, Garvey's Watchman, its name a reference to George William Gordon's The Watchman. Although it lasted just 3 issues, he claimed it had a circulation of 3,000, although this was likely an exaggeration. Garvey also enrolled in elocution lessons with the radical journalist Joseph Robert Love, coming to regard him as a mentor. With Garvey's enhanced skill at speaking in a standard English manner, he entered several public speaking competitions. Economic hardship in Jamaica led to growing emigration from the island. In mid-1910, Garvey traveled to Costa Rica, where an uncle had secured him employment as a timekeeper on a large banana plantation in the Lyman province owned by the United Fruit Company, UFC. Shortly after his arrival, the area experienced strikes and unrest in opposition to the UFC's attempts to cut its workers' wages. Although as a timekeeper he was responsible for overseeing the manual workers, he became increasingly angered at how they were treated. In the spring of 1911, he launched a bilingual newspaper, Nation La Nación, which criticized the actions of the UFC and upset many of the dominant strata of Costa Rican society in Lyman. His coverage of a local fire, in which he questioned the motives of the fire brigade, resulted in his being brought in for police questioning. After his printing press broke, he was unable to replace the faulty part and terminated the newspaper. Garvey then traveled through Central America, undertaking casual work as he made his way through Honduras, Ecuador, Colombia, and Venezuela. While in the port of Colón in Panama, he set up a new newspaper, La Prensa, the Press. In 1911, he became seriously ill with a bacterial infection and decided to return to Kingston. He then decided to travel to London, the heart of the British Empire, in the hope of advancing his informal education. In the spring of 1912, he sailed to England. Renting a room along Borough High Street in South London, he visited the House of Commons, where he was impressed by the politician David Lloyd George. He also visited Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park and began making speeches there. There were only a few thousand black people in London at the time, and they were often viewed as exotic. Most worked as laborers. Garvey initially gained piecemeal work laboring in the city's docks. In August 1912, his sister Indiana joined him in London, where she worked as a domestic servant. In early 1913, he was employed as a messenger and handyman for the African Times and Orient Review, a magazine based in Fleet Street that was edited by Duse Muhammad Ali. The magazine advocated Ethiopianism and home rule for British-ruled Egypt. In 1914, Duse Muhammad Ali began employing Garvey as a writer for the magazine. Duse Muhammad Ali also taught Marcus Garvey and Noble Drew Ali about the ancient mystic shrine. Garvey also took several evening classes in law at Birkbeck College in Bloomsbury. He planned a tour of Europe, spending time in Glasgow, Paris, Monte Carlo, Bologna, and Madrid. Back in London, he wrote an article on Jamaica for the Tourist magazine, and spent time reading in the library of the British Museum. There he discovered Up From Slavery, a book by the African-American entrepreneur and activist Booker T. Washington. Washington's book heavily influenced Garvey. Now almost financially destitute and deciding to return to Jamaica, he unsuccessfully asked both the Colonial Office and the Anti-Slavery and Aborigines Protection Society to pay for his journey. After managing to save the funds for a fare, he boarded the SS Trent in June 1914 for a 3-week journey across the Atlantic. En route home, Garvey talked with a so-called Afro-Caribbean missionary who had spent time in Basutoland and taken a Basuto wife. Discovering more about colonial Africa from this man, Garvey began to envision a movement that would politically unify black people of African descent across the world. Garvey arrived back in Jamaica in July 1914. There, he saw his article for tourist republished in the Gleaner. He began earning money selling greeting and condolence cards, which he had imported from Britain, before later switching to selling tombstones. Also in July 1914, Garvey launched the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League, commonly abbreviated as UNIA-ACL, adopting the motto of one aim, one God, one destiny. It declared its commitment to establish a brotherhood among the so-called black race, to promote a spirit of race pride, to reclaim the fallen, and to assist in civilizing the backward tribes of Africa. Initially, it had only a few members. Many Jamaicans were critical of the group's prominent use of the term Negro, a term which was often employed as an insult. Garvey, however, embraced the term in reference to black people of African descent. Was Garvey a part of the plot to steal dark-skinned natives' land in America? Garvey became UNIA's president and traveling commissioner. It was initially based out of his hotel room in Orange Street, Kingston. It portrayed itself not as a political organization, but as a charitable club, focused on work to help the poor and to ultimately establish a vocational training college modeled on Washington's Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. Garvey wrote to Washington and received a brief, if encouraging, reply. Washington died shortly after. I wonder, did they pick Washington off because Marcus got in contact with him? UNIA officially expressed its loyalty to the British Empire, King George V, and the British effort in the ongoing First World War. In April 1915, Brigadier General L.S. Blackton lectured to the group on the war effort. Garvey endorsed Blackton's calls for more Jamaicans to sign up to fight for the Empire on the Western Front. The group also sponsored musical and literary evenings as well as a February 1915 elocution contest at which Garvey took first prize. In August 1914, Garvey attended a meeting of the Queen Street Baptist Literary and Debating Society, where he met Amy Ashwood, recently graduated from the Westwood Training College for Women. She joined UNIA and rented a better premises for them to use as their headquarters, secured using her father's credit. She and Garvey embarked on a relationship, which was opposed by her parents. In 1915, they secretly became engaged. When she suspended the engagement, some rumors say, he threatened to commit suicide, at which she resumed it. Garvey attracted financial contributions from many prominent patrons, including the mayor of Kingston and the governor of Jamaica, William Manning. By appealing directly to Jamaica's white elite, Garvey had skipped the brown middle classes, comprising those who were classified as mulattoes, quadroons, and octoroons, which was paper genocide. I'm telling you, 30 minutes of butt-kissing goes a long way, but sometimes it doesn't work with wolves. They were generally hostile to Garvey, regarding him as a pretentious social climber and being annoyed at his claim to be part of the cultured class of Jamaican society. Many also felt that he was unnecessarily derogatory when describing so-called black Jamaicans, with letters of complaint being sent into the Daily Chronicle after it published one of Garvey's speeches, in which he referred to many of his people as uncouth and vulgar. One complainant, a Dr. Leo Pink, related that the Jamaican Negro cannot be reformed by abuse. After unsubstantiated allegations began circling that Garvey was diverting UNIA funds to pay for his own personal expenses, the group's support began to decline. He became increasingly aware of how UNIA had failed to thrive in Jamaica and decided to migrate to the United States, sailing there aboard the SS Talak in March 1916. Arriving in the United States, Garvey initially lodged with a Jamaican expatriate family living in Harlem, a largely black area of New York City. He began lecturing in the city, hoping to make a career as a public speaker, although at his first public speech he was heckled and fell off the stage. From New York City, he embarked on a U.S. speaking tour, crossing 38 states. At stopovers on his journey, he listened to preachers from the African Methodist Episcopal Church and the Black Baptist churches. While in Alabama, he visited the Tuskegee Institute and met with its new leader, Robert Russa Moton. After 6 months traveling across the U.S. lecturing, he returned to New York City. In May 1917, Garvey launched a New York branch of UNIA. He declared membership open to anyone of Negro blood and African ancestry who could pay the 25 cents a month membership fee. Keep in mind, the game is that the word Africa means to divide us up. Most of the Nubians over here in America were native to this land, Turtle Island. He joined many other speakers who made speeches on the street standing on step ladders. He often did so at Speaker's Corner on 135th Street. In his speeches, he sought to reach across to both Afro-Caribbean migrants like himself and so-called African Americans who were natives. Through this, he began to associate with Hubert Harrison, who was promoting ideas of black self-reliance and racial separatism. In June, Garvey shared a stage with Harrison at the inaugural meeting of the latter's Liberty League of Negro Americans. Through his appearance here and at other events organized by Harrison, Garvey attracted growing public attention. After the U.S. entered the First World War in April 1917, Garvey initially signed up to fight, but was ruled physically unfit to do so. He later became an opponent of so-called African American involvement in the conflict, following Harrison and accusing it of being a white man's war. In the wake of the East St. Louis race riots in May to July 1917, in which white mobs targeted so-called black people, Garvey began calling for armed self-defense. He produced a pamphlet, The Conspiracy of the East St. Louis Riots, which was widely distributed. Proceeds from its sale went to victims of the riots. The Bureau of Investigation, as in COINTELPRO, began monitoring him, noting that in speeches he employed more militant language than that used in print. It, for instance, reported his expressing the view that for every Negro lynched by whites in the South, Negroes should lynch a white in the North. This really scared the U.S. government. Remember, they don't like black militant groups. Marcus Garvey was building a mighty army of Negroes. By the end of 1917, Garvey had attracted many of Harrison's key associates in his Liberty League to join UNIA. Garvey also secured the support of the journalist John Edward Bruce, agreeing to step down from the group's presidency in favor of Bruce. Bruce then wrote to Duz Muhammad Ali to learn more about Garvey's past. COINTELPRO intercepted the letter and sent a negative assessment of Garvey with Duz Muhammad Ali's signature signed to it, suggesting that he simply used UNIA as a money-making scheme. Bruce read this letter at a UNIA meeting, which put pressure on Garvey's position, all by design. Bruce was turned as an informant for FBI. Garvey then resigned from UNIA, establishing a rival group that met at Old Fellows Temple. He also launched legal proceedings against Bruce and other senior UNIA members, with the court ruling that UNIA's name and membership, now estimated at 600, belonged to Garvey, who resumed control over the organization. UNIA membership grew rapidly in 1918. In June that year it was incorporated, and in July a commercial arm, the African Communities League, filed for incorporation. Garvey envisioned UNIA establishing an import and export business, a restaurant, and a laundry. He also proposed raising the funds to secure a permanent building as a base for the group. In April, Garvey launched a weekly newspaper, The Negro World, which Edmund David Cronin later noted remained the personal propaganda organ of its founder. Financially, The Negro World was backed by philanthropists such as Madam C.J. Walker, but 6 months after its launch was pursuing a special appeal for donations to keep it afloat. The feds had gotten to Madam C.J. Walker and told her it would be a good idea to stop funding Marcus Garvey if she wants to keep her business. Various journalists took Garvey to court, all brought on by FBI. They already had started putting a dent in Marcus Garvey's pockets. The lawsuit was set up after he couldn't pay. He was taken to court for his failure to pay them for their contributions, which was much publicized by Rival with the help of COINTELPRO operations. At the time, there were over 400 black-run newspapers and magazines in the U.S. Unlike many of these, Garvey refused to feature adverts for skin lightening and hair straightening products, urging black people to take the kinks out of your mind instead of out of your hair. By the end of its first year, the circulation of Negro World was nearing 10,000. Copies circulated not only in the U.S., but also in the Caribbean, Central, and South America. Several British West Indian islands banned the publication. Garvey appointed his old friend Domingo, who had also arrived in New York City, as the newspaper's editor. However, Domingo's socialist views alarmed Garvey, who feared that they would imperil UNIA. Garvey had Domingo brought before UNIA's 9-person executive committee, where the latter was accused of writing editorials professing ideas at odds with UNIA's message. Domingo resigned several months later. He and Garvey henceforth became enemies. In September 1918, Amy Ashwood sailed from Panama to be with Garvey, arriving in New York City in October. In November, she became General Secretary of UNIA. At UNIA gatherings, she was responsible for reciting so-called black-authored poetry, as was the actress Henrietta Vinton Davis, who had also joined the movement. After the First World War ended, President Woodrow Wilson declared his intention to present a 14-point plan for world peace at the forthcoming Paris Peace Conference. Garvey joined various African Americans in forming the International League for Darker People, a group which sought to lobby Wilson and the conference to give greater respect to the wishes of people of color. Their delegates, nevertheless, were unable to secure the travel documentation. At Garvey's prompting, UNIA sent a young Haitian, Eliezer Cadet, as its delegate to the conference. Despite these efforts, the political leaders who met in Paris largely ignored the perspectives of non-European peoples, instead reaffirming their support for continued European colonial rule. In the U.S., many so-called African Americans who had served in the military refused to return to their more subservient role in society, and throughout 1919 there were various racial clashes throughout the country. The government feared that African Americans would be encouraged toward revolutionary behavior following the October Revolution in Russia, and in this context, military intelligence ordered Major Walter Loving to investigate Garvey. Loving's report concluded that Garvey was a very able young man who was disseminating clever propaganda. The Bureau of Investigation's J. Edgar Hoover decided that Garvey was politically subversive and should be deported from the U.S., adding his name to the list of those to be targeted in the forthcoming Palmer raids. To ratify the deportation, the Bureau of Investigation presented Garvey's name to the Labor Department under Louis F. Post. However, Post's department refused to do so, stating that the case against Garvey was not proven. UNIA grew rapidly, and in just over 18 months it had branches in 25 U.S. states, as well as divisions in the West Indies, Central America, and West Africa. The exact membership is not known, although Garvey, who often exaggerated numbers, claimed that by June 1919 it had 2 million members. It remained smaller than the better-established National Association for the Advancement of So-Called Colored People, NAACP, although there was some crossover in membership of the two groups. The NAACP and UNIA differed in their approach. While the NAACP was a multiracial organization which promoted racial integration, UNIA had a black-only membership policy. The NAACP focused its attention on what it termed the talented tenth of the so-called African American population, such as doctors, lawyers, and teachers, whereas UNIA included many poorer people and Afro-Caribbean migrants in its ranks, seeking to project an image of itself as a mass organization. To promote his views to a wide audience, Garvey took to shouting slogans from a megaphone as he was driven through Harlem in a Cadillac. There were tensions between UNIA and the NAACP, and the latter's supporters accused Garvey of stymieing their efforts at bringing about racial integration in the U.S. Garvey was dismissive of the NAACP leader Webb Du Bois, and in one issue of the Negro World called him a reactionary under the pay of white men. Du Bois generally tried to ignore Garvey, regarding him as a demagogue, but at the same time wanted to learn all he could about Garvey's movement. In 1921, Garvey twice reached out to Du Bois, asking him to contribute to UNIA publications, but the offer was rebuffed. Their relationship became acrimonious. In 1923, Du Bois described Garvey as a little fat black man, ugly but with intelligent eyes and big head with no neck. By 1924, historian Colin Grant has suggested the two hated each other. UNIA established a restaurant and ice cream parlor at 56 West 135th Street, and also launched a millinery store selling hats. With an increased income coming in through UNIA, Garvey moved to a new residence at 238 West 131st Street. In 1919, a young middle-class Jamaican migrant, Amy Jacques, became his personal secretary. UNIA also obtained a partly constructed church building at 114 West 138th Street in Harlem, which Garvey named Liberty Hall, after its namesake in Dublin, Ireland, which had been established during the Easter Rising of 1916. The adoption of this name reflected Garvey's fascination with the Irish independence movement. Liberty Hall's dedication ceremony was held in July 1919. During the hunger strike of Terence McSwiney, Garvey supported solidarity strikes in support of McSwiney and made appeals to the British government on his behalf. Garvey also organized the African Legion, a group of uniformed men who would attend UNIA parades. A secret service was formed from Legion members, providing Garvey with intelligence about group members. The formation of the Legion further concerned the Bureau of Investigation, who sent their first full-time black agent, James Wormley Jones, to infiltrate UNIA. In January 1920, Garvey incorporated the Negro Factories League, through which he opened a string of grocery stores, a restaurant, a steam laundry, and publishing house. According to Grant, a personality cult had grown up around Garvey within the UNIA movement. Life-size portraits of him hung in the UNIA headquarters, and phonograph records of his speeches were sold to the membership. In August 1920, UNIA organized the first International Conference of the Negro Peoples in Harlem. This parade was attended by Gabriel Johnson, the mayor of Monrovia in Liberia. As part of it, an estimated 25,000 people assembled in Madison Square Gardens. At the conference, UNIA delegates declared Garvey to be the Provisional President of Africa, charged with heading a government in exile that could take power in the continent when European colonial rule ended via decolonization. Some of the West Africans attending the event were angered by this, believing it wrong that an Afro-Jamaican rather than a native African was taking this role. Many outside the movement ridiculed Garvey for giving himself this title. The conference then elected other members of the African government in exile, resulting in the production of a Declaration of the Rights of the Negro Peoples of the World, which condemned European colonial rule across Africa. In August 1921, UNIA held a banquet in Liberty Hall, at which Garvey gave out honors to various supporters, including such titles as the Order of the Nile and the Order of Ethiopia. UNIA established growing links with the Liberian government, hoping to secure land in the West African nation on which it could settle so-called African-American migrants. Liberia was in heavy debt, with UNIA launching a fundraising campaign to raise $2 million towards a Liberian construction loan. In 1921, Garvey sent a UNIA team to assess the prospects of mass so-called African-American settlement in Liberia. Internally, UNIA experienced various feuds. Garvey pushed out Cyril Briggs and other members of the African Blood Brotherhood from UNIA, wanting to place growing distance between himself and so-called black socialist groups. In the Negro world, Garvey then accused Briggs, who was of mixed heritage, of being a white man posing as a so-called black man. Briggs successfully sued Garvey for criminal libel. This was not the only time he faced this charge. In July 1919, Garvey had been arrested for comments in the Negro world about Edwin P. Kilrow, the assistant district attorney in the district attorney's office of the county of New York. When this case eventually came to court, the court ordered Garvey to provide a printed retraction. Got to make you wonder, what was Marcus Garvey's business with the Virginia eugenicists, the KKK, Powell, Cox, and Walter Plecker? Eugenics was a pseudoscience that promoted the idea that humans could be bred selectively like plants or animals for the betterment of society. Eugenicists believed that mental illness, crime, sexual promiscuity, and poverty were linked to defective genes, and that social problems could be ameliorated by limiting the reproduction of genetically undesirable individuals. In Virginia, many also believed that white people of European background possessed superior genes that should be protected from interbreeding with Africans and dark Native Americans, and people of mixed race who they held were of inferior genetic stock. In 1924, Virginia passed a compulsory sterilization law intended to limit the reproduction of disabled, poor, and feeble-minded individuals committed to state hospitals. Was Marcus Garvey in bed with the enemy? These strange bedfellows' brief alliance formed around the infamous Racial Integrity Act of 1924 and Garvey's imprisonment, exposing the gendered and classist aspects of racial purity movements. There were basically indigenous Virginians until Jim Crow, and Plecker took that as if there were no indigenous people in Virginia, full stop, after he had paper genocide the original dark-skinned natives out of history and their birthrights. Powell, Plecker, and Cox loved Garvey's Back to Africa movement. They found common ground in their strong belief in the primacy of racial essentialism. The government didn't really want so-called Negroes leaving going back to Africa, who were Native Americans, who had now been reclassified as colored. It was a psychological tactic used to make them think they came from Africa. They promoted going back to Africa, meanwhile knowing you never came from Africa. The Virginia eugenicists and Garvey focused their public campaigns primarily on the importance of racial purity and the danger of miscegenation. Marcus Garvey, which seemed antithetical for both the Virginians and Garvey. The men found common ground in their respective preoccupation with racial purity and racial superiority, as well as their opposition to integrative policies. The history of Marcus Garvey has been quite contentious and has differed greatly in offering explanations for Garvey's preoccupation with racial purity and his connections with white supremacists like the Virginia eugenicists and the Ku Klux Klan. Later on, Marcus Garvey found out that Powell, Cox, and Walter Plecker were running game on him. Noble Drew Ali told Garvey, "We are standing on our land." Was Marcus Garvey working with these guys knowingly or unknowingly? When Marcus Garvey hooked up with Noble Drew Ali, this really got the government scared. Noble Drew Ali schooled Marcus Garvey on a lesson in birthrights and how the U.S. corporation was running game to steal the native Nubians to Turtle Island's birthrights. Marcus Garvey had the people. The army and Noble Drew Ali had the message. The government had to move fast to take down Marcus Garvey before he helped Noble Drew Ali spread his message of birthrights, stirring up to good so-called blacks, Negroes, and colored they had rocked to sleep. Noble Drew Ali called Marcus Garvey the forerunner for his mission. The red, black, and green flag is not a national flag, whereas one can utilize to trace themselves back to their ancient forefathers. The red, black, and green was the banner of the UNIA, and it was primarily flown on Marcus Garvey's fleet of ships known as the Black Star Line. The red, black, and the green banner introduced the thought, idea, and notion of national flag to the so-called Negro. Noble Drew Ali imposed the Moorish American flag, a red flag with a 5-pointed green star in the middle for Moorish Americans. However, Garvey already established a red, black, and green flag to represent Negroes. Why was it necessary for Ali to introduce a new flag? Marcus agreed with Noble Drew Ali in many aspects. He knew we weren't Negroes. He just used the popular language at the time that he believed would get his movement mainstream. That resulted in him reaching many more people, but he lacked Noble Drew Ali's understanding of law, and it showed. In short, Marcus Garvey went high up on the FBI watch list. He founded the Black Star Line, a shipping company that aimed to facilitate trade within the African diaspora and promote economic independence. This shipping company aimed to facilitate trade within the African world, providing a means for black people to engage in international commerce and build economic strength. Garvey also established the Negro Factories Corporation, an initiative that sought to create black-owned businesses and provide employment opportunities for so-called black people. These ventures, though ultimately unsuccessful, demonstrated Garvey's commitment to economic empowerment. Despite their failure, they served as a testament to his unwavering dedication to the cause. He wanted to create tangible solutions for the advancement of black people, believing that economic independence was crucial for true liberation. Garvey's growing influence and message of black empowerment alarmed those in power. His success and the widespread support he garnered posed a significant threat to the existing social order. His success challenged the status quo, prompting concern and fear among those who benefited from the racial hierarchy. It threatened the existing racial hierarchy, which relied on the subjugation and disenfranchisement of black people. The U.S. government, under the guise of protecting national security, saw Garvey as a threat. They viewed his movement as a potential source of unrest and sought to undermine his efforts. They began to actively seek ways to silence him, employing various tactics to discredit and dismantle his movement. This marked the beginning of a concerted effort to shut down Garvey's movement. The government used its power to target UNIA members and disrupt their activities. It would forever taint his legacy. Despite his many contributions to the fight for black empowerment, Garvey's legacy was marred by the relentless efforts to silence him and the eventual downfall of his ventures. The Black Star Line was a beacon of hope and ambition for many African Americans in the early 20th century. Founded by the visionary Marcus Garvey, it symbolized a bold step towards black self-sufficiency and economic independence. The idea was to create a shipping line that would facilitate trade and travel between Africa and the Americas, empowering so-called black communities on both sides of the Atlantic. However, the seeds of conspiracy were sown early on. The ambitious project quickly became entangled in a web of legal troubles and financial difficulties, all created by COINTELPRO operations. The government and USA military intelligence feared Marcus Garvey was really starting his own navy. At the rate he was going, they figured they had a serious problem. Garvey's ambitious Black Star Line, while symbolic of black self-sufficiency, became entangled in legal troubles. The company faced financial difficulties from the start, struggling to stay afloat amidst a sea of challenges. These financial woes were exacerbated by a combination of factors, including inexperience and mismanagement. Many of the individuals involved in the operation of the Black Star Line lacked the necessary experience in the shipping industry, leading to costly mistakes and inefficiencies. This was due to a combination of factors. This included inexperience, mismanagement, and a lack of proper oversight. The dream of a thriving black-owned shipping line was quickly turning into a nightmare. Additionally, there were acts of sabotage from those who sought to undermine Garvey. These acts were not just random occurrences, but were part of a concerted effort to see the Black Star Line fail. Garvey had many adversaries who were threatened by his vision and influence. The U.S. government, threatened by Garvey's growing influence, saw an opportunity to strike. They used the Black Star Line's struggles to discredit Garvey and his movement. The government was wary of any movement that sought to empower so-called black people and saw Garvey's efforts as a direct challenge to the status quo. They used the Black Star Line struggles to smear Garvey in the public's view. The government launched a campaign to undermine Garvey's credibility, painting him as a fraud and a charlatan. This campaign was relentless and well-coordinated, aiming to destroy Garvey's reputation and his movement. The Justice Department, under the watchful eye of J. Edgar Hoover, targeted Garvey. Hoover, who would later become infamous for his tactics against civil rights leaders, saw Garvey's message of black empowerment as a direct threat to the established order. He believed that Garvey's influence could lead to widespread unrest and challenge the racial hierarchy that was deeply entrenched in American society. He used his growing influence within the Justice Department to build a case against Garvey. Hoover was determined to bring Garvey down, and he used every tool at his disposal to do so. The charge they focused on was mail fraud, a charge that was often used to target political dissidents. This charge was related to the sale of stock in the Black Star Line. The government alleged that Garvey had used the mail to defraud investors, a charge that was both serious and difficult to defend against. This was related to the sale of stock in the Black Star Line. The government claimed that Garvey had misled investors about the financial health of the company, promising returns that he knew were unlikely to materialize. Although the evidence was flimsy at best, the government was determined to secure a conviction. They were willing to go to great lengths to ensure that Garvey was found guilty, even if it meant bending the rules and engaging in unethical behavior. Garvey's trial was marred by irregularities and prosecutorial misconduct. The prosecution engaged in a range of unethical practices, including withholding evidence and intimidating witnesses. Key witnesses were coerced and intimidated. The government used threats and intimidation to ensure that witnesses would testify against Garvey, even if their testimony was not truthful. Evidence was fabricated to support the government's narrative. The prosecution went so far as to create false evidence to bolster their case, a clear violation of Garvey's rights. Despite a spirited defense, Garvey was found guilty in 1923. His defense team fought valiantly, but the deck was stacked against them from the start. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. This sentence was a devastating blow to Garvey and his movement, but it also galvanized his supporters and highlighted the lengths to which the government would go to silence dissent. This verdict, widely seen as politically motivated, marked a turning point. It was clear to many that Garvey was being targeted not for any real crime, but because of his efforts to uplift and empower so-called black people. It signaled the lengths to which the government would go to silence dissenting voices. The trial and conviction of Marcus Garvey remain a stark reminder of the challenges faced by those who dare to challenge the status quo and fight for justice and equality. The mail fraud trial, a travesty of justice. This trial was not just a legal proceeding, it was a calculated move to dismantle a movement that threatened the status quo. Garvey's trial was a blatant attempt to silence him. Marcus Garvey, a charismatic leader and visionary, had become a beacon of hope for many in the so-called black community. His ideas of self-reliance and economic independence were revolutionary. The charges of mail fraud were flimsy at best, all rigged by COINTELPRO operations. They were based on technicalities and misrepresentations designed to paint Garvey as a criminal rather than a leader. They stemmed from the sale of stock in the Black Star Line. The Black Star Line was Garvey's ambitious project to establish a shipping line owned and operated by so-called black people for black people. The prosecution alleged that Garvey had sold stock in a ship that had not yet been acquired by the company. This was a common practice in business, yet it was used against Garvey to discredit him. However, the ship in question, though experiencing delays, was eventually purchased by the Black Star Line. The delays were due to logistical challenges, not fraud. The trial itself was a farce. It was clear from the outset that Garvey was not going to receive a fair trial. The judge, openly hostile to Garvey, allowed the prosecution to present hearsay evidence and irrelevant testimony. This biased approach undermined the integrity of the judicial process. Garvey's lawyers were denied the opportunity to present key witnesses and evidence that could have exonerated him. The defense was systematically hamstrung, ensuring that Garvey could not mount an effective defense. The jury, influenced by the prevailing anti-black sentiment of the time, delivered a guilty verdict. This verdict was a reflection of the deep-seated racism that permeated society. Garvey's conviction sent shockwaves through the so-called black community. It was a stark reminder of the systemic oppression faced by so-called black people in America. Many saw it for what it was, a politically motivated attack on a powerful so-called black leader. Garvey's ideas and influence were seen as a threat to the established order. The conviction effectively crippled the UNIA. The Universal Negro Improvement Association, which had been a source of pride and empowerment, was severely weakened. The Black Star Line, already facing financial difficulties, folded soon after. The dream of a black-owned shipping line was shattered. Garvey's imprisonment marked a turning point in the fight for black liberation. It was a sobering moment that highlighted the lengths to which the U.S. government would go to suppress so-called black leaders. Garvey's legacy, however, lived on, inspiring future generations to continue the struggle for justice and equality. Garvey blamed Jews and Catholics, claiming that they were prejudiced against him because of his links to the KKK. His sentence was commuted by U.S. President Calvin Coolidge, and he was deported to Jamaica in 1927. Calvin Coolidge was a part of the York Rites, Freemasons, and Knights of Templar, which gave Marcus Garvey a pass. He was to never return to USA. The Knights said they only can protect him if he stays out of the U.S. He later passed away in 1940.